So this is the first of 3 books that I'm writing. It's a trilogy that will explain the entire history of the Beatles and their times. It's the Beatles and a broader social and musical history around the Beatles. In England, the title is Tune In, and it came out in England 2 years ago, and I'm very proud to say, and I think everybody here should be, I hope will be proud, to understand that this is the first foreign translation anywhere in the world. So Iceland leads the world, and I would like to thank, in particular, Ellie and Lena, the 2 publishers of the book, and Siki, who introduced me as well, because they have taken this extraordinary decision to publish a very substantial piece of work, to translate it into Icelandic, and to be the first in the world to publish it in another language. So thank you very, very much for doing that, and I hope it's a great success. In fact, I understand this morning that it has made the Icelandic book top 10 straight away in the first week of publication for books within the subject of, I think, musical and social history or something like that. So the only way is up from there, and we're hoping for a complete sellout. So thank you for coming today, and for those of you who buy it, thank you for that. So why 3 books about the Beatles? Are there not already so many books about the Beatles? I don't know. Does anybody here have other books about the Beatles in their homes? Yes? Oh, quite a few of you. Okay. You may think, I don't know how many books you have, you may think there are maybe 10 or 20 books about the Beatles. In my own home, back in England, I have about 600. It's extraordinary how many trees have been chopped down to write about these people whose music is now 50 years old. So why write some more? Well, in my opinion, the history of the Beatles has never been told properly before. It's never been researched deeply, it hasn't been written accurately, and it certainly hasn't been written with the full understanding of who these people are, where they come from, and how they were able to achieve such an extraordinary body of work in such a short space of time. Really, the Beatles were visible in the public eye from 1963 to 1970, which is only 7 years. And yet they created an incredible body of work in that time that spanned so many different expressions of artistic freedom. Music that still somehow sounds fresh and exciting today. They were, I would argue, Britain's greatest contribution to culture of the 20th century. And I would put them up there with Picasso and Hollywood as the greatest artistic forces of that century. And the Beatles still are going on into the 21st century, inspiring other artists and other performers of all kinds to follow their example and to enjoy and further their beautiful music. It's an unlikely story. We're talking here about, in essence, 4 people from England, born in a deprived city, Liverpool, very badly bombed in the Second World War. They grew up at a time of austerity and rationing. There was very little comfort, but it was all they knew, so they just got on with life, and they were the right age at the right time to be around when rock and roll music arrived from America. Rock and roll, which is really rhythm and blues, which is really the black American people, the sons of former slaves, if you like, singing the rhythmic music that originally came from Africa and has been blended with other forms of music like jazz and has formed this thing called rhythm and blues, which is then called rock and roll, and which just fires the senses of young people all around the world, and especially in Liverpool, where there wasn't much else to get excited about, and where, because of the strong Irish influence which there is in Liverpool, it's a very musical city, so lots of these kids started playing the music, and the Beatles were among them. Now, I said this is the first of 3 books. The next two books, I'm presently working hard on volume 2, they will look at the years where the Beatles are more in the public eye. This first book is about how these extraordinary young people came together and formed their attitudes and their opinions and their love of this music, and how they got themselves a manager, Brian Epstein, and a producer, George Martin. And eventually the book ends with them on the very cusp of their incredible breakthrough. That volume 2 will begin with them being number 1 on the record charts, and then ultimately, in the nicest way possible, world domination. So that's volume 2, but volume 1 is, who are these people and how did they come together? And one of the great elements of the book is that you get to see that their energy and their speed and their attitude and all the things that would drive them forward in the years to come are already in place in volume 1. Their incredible connection to their public, their dynamism and charisma on stage. So that's this first book. It's quite a big book, as you've seen, but every word in there needs to be there in order to understand who these people are. And I've got with me today just a few of the photographs from the book that I can talk through just to set a little bit of the history in this place. So I'll come back to this one in a minute. The first picture I'm going to start with is this one. This is Liverpool, England, in July 1957, 1 year before I was born. And what we see here in the middle of the photograph, and I'll just point to him with that magic pointer. This man here, he's not a man actually, he's a 16-year-old schoolboy called John Lennon. And he is the leader of a group of musicians called the Quarrymen. And they're playing a music called skiffle. Now skiffle music is actually American music of the 1920s. But America had forgotten about it, and yet somehow, in the way these things happen, it was enjoyed and preserved across the Atlantic in the UK, and it enjoyed a brief spurt of popularity in the late 1950s. And what it did was it encouraged young lads, young boys like John Lennon and his friends here, to get up on stage and start bashing out some old songs on whatever ropey equipment they could have. This was a time of austerity, as I said, so there isn't a lot of money around, so they're making their own equipment, they're making guitars or buying them really cheaply, and John Lennon is the leader of the Quarrymen, and they're playing in the garden of a church to raise funds for the church. And this picture, quite miraculous that it was taken, because this is the day that John Lennon met Paul McCartney. They had a mutual friend who brought Paul along to introduce him to John. And although we cannot see Paul McCartney in this picture, he's standing more or less where the photographer is. So this is his view of John Lennon, and he is impressed, because John Lennon is an extraordinary young man. One of those young men that you meet in life, as soon as they walk into a room, everybody's heads turn, because they have an energy about them that is just unusual and different. So John Lennon is standing there, clearly the leader, and Paul McCartney notices him and wants to impress him, and does, because Paul is, though younger, musically gifted. And John says to Paul, "Would you like to join my group?" And Paul says, "Yeah, okay." Something like that. And within a short while they are playing together. But before we get there, in the same summer of 1957, when the children of Britain are becoming conscious of rock and roll music and skiffle and picking up guitars for the first time, here on the right-hand side here is George Harrison. He's 14 years old. This is the same time as the other picture was taken. He's with his friend Arthur from school, and they're both playing their guitars, and they're learning the songs of Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly and Little Richard and Chuck Berry. And also at the same time, this is still 1957, on the left here, that young man there is a 16-year-old called Richie Starkey, who is playing drums as best he can. He's standing up, playing drums, which is unusual, but everyone was travelling around Liverpool by bus. No one had a car. And so you could only travel with whatever you could carry. And in particular, because they lived in quite a rough part of England, Liverpool was a notoriously violent place in those days. If you carried too many things, you would just be jumped on by a gang of juvenile delinquents and beaten up. So he just playing on stage with whatever he could carry, which is one stand-up drum and one tom-tom, one snare and one tom. And he is in the first skiffle group to actually start winning contests, talent contests and things like that, because he was always reckoned to be the best drummer around in Liverpool. So you get the sense already in 1957 of all these kids, their love of music is set, and they have no idea, of course, of what the future will hold, but they are intent on playing this music that has so captured their attention. So, John Lennon has invited Paul McCartney to join the group, and there is Paul, and there is John. So you can see straight away that this photograph of the Quarrymen taken in late 1957, that the other guys in the Quarrymen are just the backing guys. There are two microphones at the front and two singers at the front, Lennon and McCartney. They are now side by side. They are singing in harmony. They discovered straight away that their voices blended wonderfully well. So all the way through the Beatles recordings, you have fantastic vocal harmonies, something that very few people actually stop and think about, but they're present on almost every song. And here they are straight away, they're doing their vocal harmonies. Only two microphones, Lennon and McCartney are side by side, much as they would be all the way through the Beatles, with Paul on the left and John on the right. George Harrison on the left there, clearly younger than the others, and particularly younger than John Lennon. The age difference is, he's born in October 1940. Him in June 1942, so there's nearly 2 years between them. And then there's another 9 months between Paul and George. They were actually at the same school together, but in different years at school. So between John and George is 2.5 years. And it's quite unusual if you're 17 years old to be prepared to hang around with a 14-year-old. Because most people don't want to do that. But John Lennon was unusual in that if you stood up to him and had something new and unusual and different about you, if you stood up to him in the way that, because he would bully you otherwise, then you could stay. And so he stayed. George was always a strong-minded young man and became a strong-minded adult man as well. So here are the three of them at a family party in the McCartney family in 1958. It's a really rare, early colour photograph of them. And this is the essence of the Beatles right here, the three of them, in 1958, 5 years before they broke through. And this is all crucial because in these years, which is what you read about in the book, it's how they get everything together. So when they arrive on record and on television, on radio in 1963, they have the whole of life worked out. And they're not beginners like stars were always made, discovered by a talent spotter. Like in today's TV talent shows, someone wins it and they become a great star, but they have none of the mental equipment to handle their stardom. The Beatles always had all the understanding to cope with whatever life threw at them because of these years in the book. This is an unusual item. This is a drawing done at the art school in Liverpool. By a friend of John Lennon's. John went to the art school because he was older. He went to the art school while Paul and George were still at regular school. But by wonderful coincidence, and it's very fortunate that this was the case, these schools they went to are next door to one another. They had originally been all one school and then they were separated. So because of that, Paul and George can sneak out of school at lunchtime and hang out with the older boy, John, in the art school. And they would do the very English thing of going around the corner to the chip shop to buy fish and chips for lunch, and then take it back to the art school and sit on the stage And they're sitting there eating their food with their fingers from a bag, a typical English thing to do. And they're talking about rock and roll music, no doubt, because that was their shared passion. What new records were great and what new records were crap. And while they're doing it, without them knowing it, they're being drawn by someone in John's class at art school. And when I was writing this book, I tracked down a great many people who were witnesses to this history that I'm writing. And one of them had her sketchbook still and said, oh, I've got a sketch of them on the stage, sitting there eating their fish and chips. And this is it. And to me, there is no photograph of this moment, but it shows their togetherness. And I really wanted to put it in the book, and did. Now we're leaping forward here 2 years. Suddenly now they are the Beatles. They're not the Quarrymen anymore. They've got a name. And what an unusual name Beatles is. A name that actually at the time when people first heard it, they thought, oh, it's horrible. It'll never last. Change that name because you'll never become successful with a name like Beatles. But the thing about the Beatles was they were always very strong-minded people. And they liked the name. So just because other people said change it, they went, no, we won't change it. We'll do it the way we want to do it. And this becomes exactly the way they lived their life through the whole of the 60s. Continually doing things only really to please themselves, but finding along the way that most people enjoy what they do and want to be part of it. They're standing on stage in a nightclub, a bar, really, in Hamburg in Germany. And how the Beatles came to go to Germany is a long and interesting, fascinating story, full of amazing people doing interesting things. They end up by a succession of moments of good fortune landing this contract to go and play in a bar in Hamburg, and it's the red light district of Hamburg. It's the place that parents usually try and prevent their children going. It's the shady part of town. And here they are, 1,000 kilometers from home, away from their parents, and they're going to have a good time. And they play for up to 8 hours every night, for on this trip 6 nights a week, and on the next trip 7 nights a week. So it gave them incredible stamina and energy. They worked out where they were strong, and they worked out where they were not so strong and needed to improve. And they really did discover who they were and what they were trying to achieve here. And they had a great time. And this is the first night in Hamburg. And what we see here is left to right, John, George, their new drummer, Pete Best, who has just joined them. That's Paul, of course. And over on the right there is the Beatles bass player, Stuart Sutcliffe, who was a great friend of John's from the art school. He was, by pretty much everyone's definition, a brilliant artist. He was prolific in all styles of painting, a very gifted young man. Fancied himself as kind of James Dean with the dark glasses on stage there. Not very good at playing bass, but they're not very good as a group at this point. They're still learning. And Paul and Stuart have a rivalry for John's attention, because he wanted to be close to John, and then Stuart comes into the group kind of as John's best friend, and Paul feels put out, and there's all these kind of tensions going on inside the group, but this is how they arrive in Hamburg as a 5-piece group. The Stuart Sutcliffe story is an extraordinary one in itself. This very gifted young artist fell in love with a German girl, stayed in Germany, started to have very bad headaches when he was about 20, 21 years old, and then died of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 21. Never lived to see the success that the Beatles had, even though he had been one of them. This is on the second trip to Hamburg. This is the three of them now. If this picture was in colour, what we'd see are these outrageous cowboy boots that they're wearing, Texas cowboy boots, leather trousers, leather jackets, black shirts, pink caps, and a lot of attitude. They're on the roof of the club that they played in Hamburg, the Top 10 Club. This is John and Paul. They used to call themselves the Nurk twins as a duo. They were very close friends. They had their differences, but mostly their differences complemented one another. And this is them on a trip to Paris, Paris in France in 1961. They went over there to meet one of their friends from Hamburg who had moved to Paris. And while they are there, their friend Jürgen Vollmer, cuts their hair into the Beatle haircut. Now, of all the things in the 1960s that the Beatles did, I would say that the greatest revolution of all was their promotion of what was known as long hair. Because in those days, pretty much everybody, all men, wore short hair. And the Beatles had this long hair that was just combed forward into a fringe. And everyone talked about their long hair, even though it looks quite short now. And hair became the single greatest status symbol, if you like, of revolution in the 60s. If you grew your hair long, you were bound to upset pretty much everyone. And so lots of people did, of course. Even I did. Would you believe it? Now, at the same time as the last photograph in late 1961, this is George and Ringo. Ringo is in another group in Liverpool called the Hurricanes, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. But he's the Beatles' friend. And whenever their drummer Pete Best is ill or cannot make an engagement to play, they call on Ringo, and every time he's with them, they enjoy it much, much more than they do with Pete. So Pete's days in the Beatles are numbered. They want him out, and they want to get this guy, Ringo, in. At the end of 1961, we're 1 year away from where the book finishes. The Beatles gained themselves a manager. I don't have his picture here, but Brian Epstein is the Beatles' manager. He's only a few years older than them. He's just 6 years older than John Lennon, for example. But there is a generational gap there, because he is a child of the 30s. He lived through the war in a way that the Beatles, who were war babies, didn't really quite follow. And he had done in England what we call national service, conscription, enforced conscription, where you have to serve 18 months in the army. I don't know, has there been conscription in Iceland at any time? No. Okay, well, until the late 1950s, if you were 18 years old, a male in Britain, you had to go into the army for 18 months. And the Beatles were incredibly lucky. We are all incredibly lucky, because had national service, this enforced conscription, not been abolished just in the nick of time, they would have had to have gone into the army, and then they would have been in different places at different times. The Beatles would never have happened. But because national service was abolished, they were spared, and they could stick together and carry on doing what they wanted to do. So they've got themselves a manager now, and this is the first photograph that he had taken of them, so that he could try to interest record companies in giving these boys a contract, into trying to get them onto television, onto radio, and so on. So this is the Beatles in December 1961, John, George, Paul, and Pete. He says to them, however, that although this is a good look, it's very hard in those days to actually get yourselves in somewhere if you look as rebellious as this. Leather was held to be associated with rebellion, motorcycle gangs and all of that, and people didn't like it. And if they wanted to get themselves onto television, they really had to change the way they looked, and if they wanted to get on radio, they had to change the way they looked, and so on. And Brian Epstein gave them a choice: you can stay as you are, and life, I may not be able to do all the things you want to do, or you can make a slight change, and then everything should open up. And they agreed that they would change their look, and they changed from that to this in 1962. They've got suits on now. They've actually designed these suits. Beatles, very opinionated young guys, always had views on what they wanted. And in this case, they wanted to change into these kind of suits, very sharp, mod, narrow lapels, narrow trousers, very particular ties, knitted woolen ties they wore. So this is the look that they want to have now, and they're beginning to look like the Beatles who will break through. The books I'm writing are not about icons and superstars. All of us, they're not in any way superhuman. They are just everyday people, but with unusual attitude and ideas. That's all. They're artistically talented, but they are, in every other sense, just regular people. And I want to make these books the books full of human lives. And particularly a lot of oral history. I'm very interested in oral history as a method of reporting the past. And I tried to track down as many people as I could who had a close association with them that was much more real than you would imagine, because they're not just famous people. They're people you could go and have a coffee with or go around to their house or whatever. And the Beatles always did have this fantastic rapport with their audience. Now, in this case, this photograph is John Lennon in 1962 at the age of 21 with a schoolgirl in Liverpool who was 15 called Lindy Ness. And nothing improper happened, I'm relieved to say, although if it had happened I would report it anyway because I'm just interested in the truth. But nothing did happen here that was improper. He looked after her, he protected her. And they were genuinely friends and nothing more. But when the Beatles went to Hamburg, they told their audience in Liverpool, please don't forget us. Here is our address, please write to us. And one of the joys of writing this history of the Beatles is that it's a history of a period of time where things were documented. We're not talking about emails here or anything that might not be preserved. We're speaking here of people who wrote letters. And when the Beatles were in Hamburg, they took writing paper with them and wrote letters back to all their fans in Liverpool, whoever wrote to them. And to Lindy, John Lennon would write extraordinary letters of 12, 15 pages, full of poetry and drawings and mad off-the-wall ideas and great bursts of lunacy, verbal lunacy. And she, in turn, though only 15, was writing similar letters back to him. So they formed this great friendship, and I tracked her down. I spent years on these books, tracking down everyone who has something that might be interesting to say. And she had never been interviewed before. I found her living in France, went over to see her, and she had photographs and letters still, and her diaries, which are unbeatable for a historian if you can find someone with a diary. So this is John with Lindy Ness, and just one example of many of the relationships that they had with the public, with their audience. And this would continue even in the late 1960s, no matter how huge the Beatles were by this point. If you wrote a letter to them, you might, not necessarily would, but you might actually get a proper handwritten reply. So this is going on all the time. And of course, for me, as I say, as the historian, finding as many of these letters, these documents as possible is my mission in life. This is the Beatles in Hamburg on their third visit in 1962. They are actually holding here, you can see that there and this here. They are tubes of about that long of a German women's slimming pill called Preludin, which the waiters in these nightclubs used to hand out to all the musicians in order to give them more stamina to play through the night. We're talking here about drugs in essence, although you could buy them in any pharmacist. So they were not illegal, but they were like amphetamine. And if you're going to play through the night for hours, you do need something to keep you going. So they started to swallow these things. And the way in which they took their drugs, and the Beatles and drugs is a subject that is intertwined through the 1960s, because they and others began to experiment with other things, is that John Lennon, as we can see, took the most. I think he's had a few here, don't you? He's taken a few of these slimming pills. George Harrison on the right there was close behind John. Paul was always a little bit more cautious. His mother was a nurse, and he was aware of the potential dangers of taking things like narcotics. And Pete, on the left-hand side here, never actually took anything. They all drank a lot, like young guys do, but he didn't actually take any drugs. He was really a misfit in the Beatles. He didn't have the personality that they had, and he didn't hang out with them socially. So Pete is about to be replaced in the Beatles. And this is the week before their first record is released. This is Liverpool in September 1962. And we're looking at, from left to right, of course, Paul, George, John and Ringo. They are standing on a strip of wasteland in front of this huge warehouse. Liverpool, being a port city, has very substantial warehouses. And that one is still there to this day, because what as a historian, I like to go and find where photographs have been taken. And I went on a location hunt around Liverpool with some friends many years ago, and found that this warehouse is still standing. So I knew that the name of this street that they are standing is a place called Saltley Street. That was in the back of my mind from some distant research done in the 1980s. When I was researching this book, I did the family histories for all of the Beatles. And I discovered more than I'd ever realized before that they have such strong Irish roots. Liverpool is a seaport and it's right adjacent to Ireland. So in the middle of the 19th century, when there was a terrible famine in Ireland, where millions of people were starving to death, they fled onto the ships full of disease and starvation, and they sailed to Liverpool, and many then left again and went on to the United States of America, and many stayed in Liverpool, and Liverpool has, to this day, a strong Irish or Irish-based population. The Lennons were from Ireland too, and when they arrived in Liverpool in about 1846, they lived on this street. They lived right there, in the most appalling housing that had not long been cleared away before this photograph was taken. So without knowing it, John Lennon is standing where his family had first arrived in Liverpool. I'm sure when he was killed in 1980, at the age of 40, he still had no idea of that extraordinary coincidence. But actually the Beatles story is full of such extraordinary coincidences. Moments where you think, oh, that's so unlikely, you must be making it up, but no, they happen time and time and time again. So this is the Beatles in the end of 1962, standing more or less exactly where my book begins, in the middle of the 19th century, with the family histories. Now, I'll just show you a few more pictures, because although this is where Tune In finishes, let's just have a quick peek at where the next two books will be going. 1963, this is the Beatles in Sweden, just about to make their debut appearance on Swedish television in a wonderful show which you can watch on YouTube called Drop In, a really great show. 1964 in London, they've already now taken over or changed the course of popular culture in many countries of the world. I was yesterday with Dr. Gudny, and he gave me a copy of his book about Icelandic popular music of the post-war period, and explaining to me, as indeed others have too, the Beatles' impact on Iceland, even though they never came here, was great, because groups began forming in their image and playing their kind of music, beat music. And A Hard Day's Night, the film, came here and was seen by lots of people. So the Beatles begin to, very rapidly, change the course of youth culture around the world and open it up in a very dramatic way. That's where Volume 2 will be going. 1965, I'm doing one picture from each of the years to come. This is the Beatles at their biggest ever concert, Shea Stadium in New York City. 55,500 people, the first big stadium show. They have tiny amplifiers. No one could really hear them, and of course most of the audience are screaming anyway, and no one's really listening to them. They just want to see these guys. They're not necessarily interested in being entertained by the music. They just want to be near these famous guys, these extraordinarily charismatic guys. And here, This is Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, who would be dead within 2 years of this photograph being taken. 1966. They're on their last tours now, because they very rapidly got tired of these concerts where no one was listening and where they were just in the middle of a three-ring circus everywhere they went. So they decided they're going to give up touring. 1967, moustaches and beards suddenly, everything's changing. This is the Beatles in a pub, a public drinking bar in London, with the owners and the children of the owners, or the son of the owners in the pub. 1968, they're in India now, studying transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and suddenly they're opening up the possibility of discovering more about your inner self. I maintain that the great public surge in popularity of yoga and meditation and such like is due to the Beatles. They didn't invent it, of course they didn't. It had been going for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and yet, because they did this, it became something that other people considered to be possible in their lives. And the last photograph of the Beatles taken together, or from the last day, August 1969, they are on the verge of breaking up now. George, Paul, John and Ringo, they are still the Beatles, but their interests are separating and diverging, and they're about to break up. They have in fact recorded together for the last time before this photograph was taken. In fact, I don't think they were ever together as a foursome after this very day. They had times when the two of them were together or three of them were together, but I think this was the end of it. So that's where the books are going in volumes 2 and 3, but volume 1 is how it all came together, and it is an extraordinary story. Once again, I'm delighted to be here in Reykjavik to be speaking to you today, and thanks again to the publishers of this book for having the courage and the determination to translate it, such a huge piece of work. And I hope for those of you who have bought it that you enjoy reading it. Thank you very much. If anybody would like to ask me anything, I'm happy to answer a question or two. Stuart.
You and I were born just within a few weeks of each other.
Okay.
So by the time
I don't remember you.
No. But by the time this happened,
yes.
I'm speaking for myself, I wasn't really into pop music. I was a bit too young for it.
Yes.
Right, an elder sister and an elder brother, and I could see that they were both interested in this kind of thing in the 60s. So when I did finally get interested in pop music, I was into the 70s. I felt cheated when I look back. Did you have a similar sense that this had gone on and you've been just a bit too late for it? And has that driven what you've done since?
Thank you. Did everybody hear that, or should I repeat it? You heard it? Okay.
No, please repeat it.
Oh, please repeat. Okay. Stuart and I were born in the same period of time. He had elder brothers. Was it a brother and a sister?
Sister and a brother.
A sister and a brother who were into the Beatles, but he was just a bit too young. And when he was old enough to really appreciate the Beatles, they had gone, and he felt cheated because he'd missed out on something. Did I feel the same way? Actually, no, I didn't. For the simple reason I was a precocious little kid. And when the Beatles broke through, I was 5 years old and I was into it, big time. I was a fan of the Beatles from the age of 5, and it never went away. And so you can imagine how happy I am to be doing this for a job, because this is actually my profession. I write full time. So to be a Beatles historian is a wonderful feeling, because this is something I don't actually remember life without them, because I have no memories of before I was 5. So I don't feel cheated. The only thing is I missed out on seeing them perform live in concert, because they last played in the UK when I was 7, and I was too young to go. I don't even remember being conscious of the possibility of going. By the time I was 9 or 10 and I was aware that people gave concerts and one could go as a member of the audience, it was too late. I missed out on that. So in that one respect, I'm sorry, but otherwise, because I was such a precocious little brat, I'm okay. I do actually have many memories of them in the 60s. I remember them being on television, and in the late 60s when John was with Yoko, my mother, who was a big Beatles fan, started to turn away from John. She didn't like him anymore, and I became very defensive. Even though I didn't really understand what they were doing, I was defensive. I have those kind of memories of trying to protect them, if you like. The thing about the Beatles is that many people, this is a common experience among many people, many of you here today I expect as well, the music is extraordinary, but beyond that there comes a level of inquiry. You want to know more about them. And this was true right from the beginning. The first literature about the Beatles was biographical in nature because people really did want to know who they were and where they came from. And as I said, there are something like 600 books on them now. And no doubt there will be a great many more. But but coming back to where I began, I'm writing this because I don't feel that their story's ever been really properly told. It's been told very often, but never very well. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to write a book that will be around for the people in the future when we're all gone, who will still be interested in the Beatles because their music is still going to be around. And children of the future will be studying them. And indeed many of the children of today, 2 or 3 generations on, are enjoying their music. So this book needs to be done. It's an opportunity to try to get history right before it's too late. Histories are usually written long after the event, and I'm trying to write this one a mere 50 years or so after the event. Many of the participants in the story have died, of course they have. But it is still just possible now. If it isn't done now, it will be too late, and that's what I'm trying to do. So thank you, Stuart, for that. Any other questions now that you've heard one? Yes?
My name is Jonas. I was asked by a Facebook friend to ask you a question.
Yes.
Friends that didn't come here today. The question was if Ringo and Pete Best were friends, and the perspective is there on that topic.
Okay. So was Ringo, the Beatles drummer, friendly with Pete Best, the drummer before him?
Yeah.
In the Beatles?
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa. They were not friends. They knew one another, of course, because they were drummers. They were often on the same concert bill, if you like. Actually, the Beatles' early shows were not concerts, they were dances. They would be the band that you danced to. On a stage like this, many of the Beatles' appearances in this book take place in halls exactly like this. So they did know one another, but they weren't particular friends. They were just friendly. Hello, how are you doing? All right, maybe have a beer together, but they were not close friends, no. Pete Best was the Beatles drummer until just before they became successful, and then they got rid of him, which was unfortunate timing for Pete, because he then had to watch as they became the biggest act in entertainment there had ever been. And that was obviously a difficult ordeal for him. And I will be following his story through books 2 and 3 of this series as well, even though he's no longer in the Beatles, because he has to live with that. And that's an interesting thing from a human point of view. Just how did he cope with being the guy that they had fired just before they became successful? He had a career of his own. You would think that an association with the Beatles would have helped him, but it didn't really. It became a bit of a millstone around his neck, English expression, I don't know if you know what that means, a heavy weight to carry, in other words. But that's interesting from a historical point of view as well, so I will be looking at that. So, thank you. Thank you. Was it your children, did you say, who had the question? Whose question was that?
It was actually from a Facebook friend.
Ah, a Facebook friend, okay. Good. I'll take one more, I think, before we can just then socialise together. And of course the book is on sale outside, and I will be very pleased to sign to whoever would like a copy. One more question? Yes, at the back there.
I always student believe that it was George Martin who fired not the Beatles, not the others.
Yes, you had always understood that it was George Martin, the Beatles producer, who fired Pete Best and not the others. Yes, no, that is incorrect. One of the myths about the Beatles is that other people could impose their will on whatever they wanted. So if Brian Epstein wanted to make them dress differently, he could instruct them to do that. Or, as you say, that George Martin told them they had to get rid of their drummer. You could not tell these guys anything. They would tell you in two very rude words what to do with your opinion if you tried to tell them what to do. No, the decision was theirs, and it could only be their decision. What George Martin did say was that if you keep this man as your drummer, I will not use him in the recording studio. So the Beatles knew from their record producer that every time they would go to make a record, they would have to put up with a drummer that they hadn't met, what was called a session drummer. So a freelance drummer who would be hired for the occasion and wouldn't know them, and they wouldn't know him, and they wouldn't have that mental connection that was so vital to their music making. So the Beatles were already fully intent on getting rid of him. But when George Martin said that, they just knew that this guy's got to go, and he's got to go now. So that kind of, in a sense, accelerated it perhaps, because they didn't want to be playing with a stranger every time they went to a recording studio. So no, it wasn't George Martin. The Beatles story is full of stories. The Beatles history is full of stories and myths like that have taken root. And in these books, I'm not trying to disprove any myths. I'm just trying to tell the story, and the myths can just kind of fall away because it is time, as I said. It goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about the story having been told often but never very well. So things like that have been allowed to, they've been written by other writers who really haven't done their jobs properly. And this project for me is something like a 25-year project. So if I get it wrong, then, well, you know, then I'm only human. But I'm trying to get it as right as possible. And that's the aim. So, no need to rush away afterwards, but thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It is, once again, a great honour and a privilege to be here in Reykjavik. And I thank again the publishers for putting out the first ever foreign translation of this book. So again, Iceland leads. Thank you very much.